Okay, the next thing that we're going to do is we are going to look at the 5 transforms in After Effects. So in order to do this, I need a layer to animate. So I'm going to go to this comp 2 that I made, and actually I want to rename this. So I'm going to hit the return key to make this editable, and I'm going to name this transforms. I think the easiest thing to animate right now is going to be a solid layer. So to make a solid layer, I'm going to go to Layer, New, Solid. The keyboard shortcut is Command Y. This gets you to the same place. You get to the solid settings. As you see, it's going to be the same size as your composition. You could change the size if you want to. I'm just going to leave it at the same size. And we can change the color. And it'll automatically name it according to the color that you've chosen. So if I wanted to choose a green, it'll say green. If I wanted to have it yellow, it'll change it to yellow. So whatever you pick as a color, it will name it accordingly. So I'll hit OK. When you use this eyedropper, you don't need to click on the thing that you are selecting. You just hover over the color and then you hit return. And now I have this color, and it's a little bit hard to see. I think I actually want something that's a little bit brighter. So to change the solid settings, I'm going to go to Layer, Solid Settings, and then I can change the brightness of this. There we go. That's a little bit easier to see. Now, one of the first things that we see when we have a new layer is the anchor point. That'll be this marking right in the middle. So the anchor point is really what everything revolves around. When you move something, the position of the layer is going to be the position of the anchor point. When you rotate something, it's going to be rotating around the anchor point. So the anchor point is really important. So before you do any animation, you want to look at the anchor point and decide if that is where you would like it. In this case it is. I'm going to keep it in the middle. But if I wanted to change where the anchor point is, I can't just click on this with the mouse and move it, because you'll see it moves the layer. So now I'm moving the position of this layer. So in order to change the anchor point, you need to go up here to the Pan Behind tool. In parentheses, it's the anchor point tool. The keyboard shortcut is the letter Y. So if we click on this, now we can move this anchor point without moving the position of the layer. Also, if you want it to snap in place, you can hold down the Command button and it will snap. So I could put this back to the middle by holding the Command key, and it will snap to these points. So in order to see the actual position of the anchor point, we're going to twirl down this little menu here next to the tag, and we see Transform. And then we twirl this down again, and now we can see anchor point, position, scale, rotation, and opacity. These are the 5 transforms. So the first one we talked about a little bit, and that is the anchor point. As you can see, by default in HD, it's going to be 960 by 540, which is exactly half of 1920 by 1080. So that puts it right in the middle. The position is also 960 by 540, right in the middle. Now to start with, they just happen to be the same. Now if I have the selection tool selected, or the keyboard shortcut for that is the letter V, I can grab this layer and I can move it around, and you'll see that now the position of the layer is now 1360, 848, while the anchor point is still 960 by 540, because the anchor point is local to the layer. If you wanted to change the anchor point, like if I wanted to have this in the top left corner, I could put 0, 0, and you'll see that it actually also shifted this so it looks like it moved, even though all I did was I changed the anchor point. So if you want to move the anchor point after the fact, that's when you would need to use this Pan Behind tool. I think most of the time we will want the anchor point to be in the middle of the object. So again, if I wanted to move this object back to the middle, I can punch in 960, 540, and it'll go back to the middle. So position is just that. These are X and Y values. So X, of course, is the horizontal movement. Y would be the vertical movement. You can hold down the Shift key and it will constrain it to one dimension or the other, whichever way you are moving it. If I am starting to slide it one way and I hold down Shift, it'll constrain it. So it'll only move along that axis. So this is position. And typically you can just grab layers and move them with the selection tool. Now, sometimes you might accidentally grab the edge or the bounding box. So if I do this, if I accidentally grab this edge and I do this and I see that I've now changed the shape and I've scaled this, that's where we're going to look at this next one down. So after position is scale, and I can see it says 20 and 100. So I've accidentally scaled it along the X value. Now I could grab that and try to get it back to 100, or the easier thing, unclick this little constrained proportions link and then make sure that the number is the same on X and Y. And then I can click that again. And if I wanted to scale this, I can just click and drag. Any blue numbers, you can either click on them and drag up and down to change their value, or you can click on them once and then enter a value manually and it will change that. So anywhere you see a blue number, you have an option that you can either click and hold it down and make an adjustment. I'm going to hit undo. Or you can click on it and manually enter a number. So for scale, we usually want to have this with the constrained proportions option left alone. If for some reason you want to scale the X independent of the Y, you can turn that off and then scale that. But for now, I'm going to put these back to the same value and then turn that back on. Now rotation gives you two things. There's a 0x and 0.0 degrees. So I can either change the first value, which is how many times something is rotating, or I can change the next value, which is how many degrees something is rotating. So for right now, I don't have any keyframes yet, so I could change this number and it won't do anything, because it needs to see a difference between keyframes before it does how many times you're rotating. So I'm going to leave this at 0. Degrees, I can change this and it will rotate. And as you see, it's rotating around the anchor point. All right, I'm going to change that back to 0. And let's look at opacity. Opacity is the opposite of transparency. So right now, the opacity is 100%. That means that this is 100% visible. It is not transparent at all. If I click and drag closer to 0, you'll see that it is becoming more and more transparent until once I get to 0, it is completely transparent. So opacity is the opposite of transparency. So now we have an idea of what these things do. Let's talk about how to animate them. So I'm going to click on position and I'm going to click this little stopwatch next to the word position, and it's going to turn blue and it's going to give me a keyframe. That means that this moment on the timeline is locked into this position. So if I move to another moment, I'm going to grab this current time indicator and I'm going to move maybe 2 seconds later. And now I'm going to grab this object and I'm going to change its position. I'm just going to move it over here. And you'll see that now we have this line and it has these little markings on it. And if we look closer, we can see that there is a dot and there's another little bigger dot. And then we have a little square. What do these things mean? Well, the squares actually indicate the keyframes. So I have one square on this side, and if I move over here, I have another square on the other side. These little tiny dots are actually where the anchor point is on every frame. So this is 2 seconds which means that at 24 frames per second, that is 48 total frames. So if I scrub through this, and if I were to count these individually, I would see that there were actually 48 dots. Between this square and this square, 48 total dots. So that is where the anchor point is at every frame. So that's what those little dots are. These little circles right here, these are actually Bezier handlebars. So if I grab this, I can actually change the Bezier curve of this position, which is really cool. So now if I back out and we watch this playback, we can see that it has a little bit of a curve to it. And this is all under position. So this is how you animate the position of an object. We made a keyframe here, and then we moved to 2 seconds using this time indicator, and then we grabbed the object and we moved it. And when you move it, it automatically creates another keyframe. You only need to press the stopwatch one time, and that is to activate animation on that layer. And then after we had moved it, we moved the handlebars to give it a little bit of a curve. And now we have animation with position. Animation with scale is the same thing. I'm going to click on this little stopwatch and that activates animation on scale. We see that it has created a little keyframe. And now if I go back to 2 seconds, I can change the scale. And I see that it is interpolating that information. So we're animating position, we are animating scale. Let's animate the rotation. So rotation is very similar. We're turning that on. And then we are going to create something that is different. After Effects is just looking for a difference in this parameter. As soon as you make a keyframe and you move to a different area on the timeline, as soon as you do something different, After Effects will see that it's different and it will create another keyframe for you. So right now I started this first keyframe, zeros, and if I go to this next keyframe, I can tell it rotate 1 time and also change 45 degrees. So now, not only is it going to rotate once, but it's also going to rotate an additional 45 degrees. If I want to jump back and forth between keyframes, that's when I use these little white triangles, or these white arrows. If I press on that, it'll jump to the next keyframe on the timeline. And if I want to go back, I can click on that little arrow and it'll take me back to the previous keyframe. So this is a fast way to navigate back and forth between your keyframes. So now I'm going to change the opacity. And on this, I'm going to start off with a low opacity. Maybe I'll even start it at 0. And then I'm going to jump to this next keyframe and change this to 100. I'm also going to change the work area. Right now, this whole timeline is 10 seconds, and to play it back, I don't need to play the whole 10 seconds just to preview the first 2 seconds. So I can change this work area. I'll move this handlebar in here, and I'll stop just a little bit after 2 seconds. And now when I hit play, it's going to preview only what is inside of that work area. And we can see that I have animation on 4 out of the 5 transforms. Usually you don't need to worry about animating the anchor point. You can, but sometimes it becomes a little bit confusing what is animating your position and what is animating the anchor point. So I suggest not worrying about animating the anchor point at all. Another thing is that you can actually grab keyframes and move them around. So I could grab these keyframes and move them around along the timeline. And if I wanted to stagger the movement, I could move them around so they don't necessarily start at the same time. I can also copy and paste keyframes. So let's say I wanted this to scale up and scale down. I could actually grab this first keyframe and hit copy, which is Command C, and then I could go later down the timeline and hit paste, and it's going to paste it wherever the timeline indicator is. So I hit paste, and look at that. Now I have the same scale. So it's actually going to scale down and then scale up. Looks a little bit clunky to me, but I think you get the idea. So this is how you start animating the basic transforms inside of After Effects. So try it out and see if you can get it to work.